All right, we are recording.
All right. So our discussion will be based in power, focusing specifically in Latin American pop culture. So one thing that we've talked about, starting at the beginning of our class was 000. And I think that that's a good spot to start, especially talking with power, because that was a very structured society that completely broke down when one element of power was taken away. I don't know if you guys have anything to add on that.
Yeah, in terms of the film, I liked how it displayed power at the most minimalistic level, and then as the show went on and the episodes kept on getting bigger, it kind of went up to the highest power, which is the government, and then the port in New Orleans, I think it was, with the billionaires constructing the deal. But yeah, power has a huge impact in the drug trade. 000 did a great job showing it specifically within like the first 10 minutes. Um, there was an older gentleman who kind of oversaw the whole thing. And I'm pretty sure either his grandson or his son, I can't remember now, was trying to, overthrow him eventually, we learned. But we learned how that power is like really incomprehensible to, what the government gets out of that drug deal and how they like allow it to happen because it gives them power and money. And yeah, that's actually a really good place to start for this. But that's those are my thoughts on the initial film.
Yeah, I think too, thinking about just how an element of power in one country can drastically affect the elements of power in other countries,
Hmm.
just in the sense of how big their drug trade enterprise was within that film.
Yeah. I mean, kind of going off the first part, I remember because from Jose Marti's Our America, I guess power was like kind of a big topic in there, where he was kind of calling on Latin America and its people to reclaim its political, cultural, and like kind of intellectual independence from not just like Spain and like those powers, but mostly from the United States. And he's kind of like asking the people and writing this like persuasive essay in order to ask them to define Latin America and to define itself on its own terms, kind of. And he like rejects like external power and like the US and European systems. And he says, I said, there's a quote that he said that Latin America must be ruled not by the lettered foreigner, but by the countryman. And he kind of like criticizes local leaders who mimic like European ways and ignore the real conditions of Latin America. So like kind of just based on that first part, if you guys have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely, Jose Marti was advocating kind of a revolution to take back the power that wasn't really theirs because they were colonized, but just to take it back because they're being disproportionately treated in terms of what that power means to them now. Like, obviously, it's a different country trying to take control of a group of people who are a while away and without any authority there. Like, the power has no meaning, so they're just trying to take it back. I think that's a great point that you made, Max.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
too,
oh,
one thing
you,
that I remember talking about around Jose Marti was, I believe it's called Chuck Mole. Um, there was it was this artifact and it was made of pure stone, and it was supposed to be a representation of like a divine figure
Mm,
associated with sacrifice. And I think that that
yeah.
was just another way that Jose Marti was able to incorporate not only conventional power structures, but also like associating it with religion, which can be in itself another power structure,
Mhm.
um, and just how they brought offerings to the gods. And he kind of related that back to our America being like a dormant figure that we could awaken through his the use of his words, which is also another term um, for a form of power.
Yeah,
Yeah,
was this the statue that eventually became just a depiction of Jose Marti? Or
So,
I
that
think
was
so.
it?
if
Yeah.
I'm remembering correctly.
Okay. That's what I thought. Yeah, that statue obviously has its own meaning of power by itself. You know, he didn't really, I don't think he made himself the centerpiece of that statue. It was just kind of associated with him for what he was believing in and what he was advocating. So in terms of like wanting power, and we can like associate it back in the first place with why they wanted revolution is because there was no representation there. And Jose Marti had the representation. And although he might not have advocated for give me the power, he got it anyway because of what he believed in. So um, the kind of transfer of power over to him might not have came directly because of his request, but just because he earned it. So
Yeah. Like, I guess they wanted revolution because of like colonialism and how I guess they got like stripped of their own identity in a way. And kind of when we were talking about that statue, it just like reminded me that there was like a couple other like I guess like terms or ideas that we talked about in other like readings. I know in Oscar Wow, if you guys remember like the Fuku curse. I
mm,
don't know why, but that kind of just like reminded me of that. Like it was like the legacy of like the colonialism and dictatorship that like haunts the families even when they like leave the country, I guess. And yeah, it would like kind of represented that power. I don't know if that kind of makes sense to you guys.
Yeah. Well, I think too, thinking back to when we talked about Fuku and how the idea of fate in itself is a form of power, because at least thinking about like the Greeks before this and how their ideals was that your fate can't be changed, and it kind of relates back to Fuku in the sense that like if you do this one thing, your life is cursed from then on. So if you lack the funeral, you'll never find happiness. Like that's such a very strong form of power that you can't really control beyond your personal actions.
Yeah,
it's also an interesting form of power because there's no materialized or physical element behind it. Most of it's all just hearsay, but it's such a truth to the people um, that like it's real for them, and to speak on it, it definitely if they're believing one thing because of it, um, that definitely speaks to the amplitude of power it has. Moving on with the power piece, more like a physical, what we see in Yuri Herrera's Kingdom Con, just a more traditional type of power with the king and how he exhibits his power to people who disobey him or you know people who are like rising up, like our main character who you know busks on the street for money and then eventually becomes part of the king's quarry. Um, if we could talk about just more traditional power versus like Fuku or what we did earlier with Jose Marti, kind of earning the power.
uh, yeah, no, definitely that's kind of like I guess if not like the main point in Kingdom Cons. And I guess traditional power that also reminded me of like the Bad Bunny album and just like Bad Bunny as an artist in general, how he became like one of the biggest artists without switching to English to make his music like more mainstream. And he centers like Puerto Rico and like identity and speaks in like slangs and resists gender norms.
Mm.
Like I guess through pop culture as a whole, he kind of like fights for cultural independence, like Mark T kind of talked about. And he like doesn't, I guess, yeah, translate his songs and calls out like US politicians and stuff like that. But I guess that all kind of ties into that like idea with Kingdom Cons as well.
Yeah, I think that also kind of reminded me of just, do you remember when we talked about the two different posters that the Italian nation
Like
mentioned.
the
How,
World Cup one?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah,
like
yeah,
the of like what you put out is going to be perceived by others no matter how you put it out, but the way you change it or the way that you present it can make a difference.
Hmm.
yeah.
So like the fact that he is making a stand and saying, I know that English music is the most conventional or the most yeah, usually the most popular at the time, but is still not willing to change his music for that convention is such a strong statement. Whereas like
Mhm.
Italian government used that against their own people in a way, um, for propaganda.
And this was these were the war posters or the World Cup posters
The World Cup
or both.
posters.
The world,
Well, I
yeah,
mean,
they were kind of
technically,
both of them,
yeah, but the
honestly.
World
Yeah,
Cup. Because I think it was the one where it was the wording on the poster was just so drastically different from what was published to the rest of the world.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
And I know we also kind of looked at I think it was the Argentinian one, where like the players were like their faces was in the color of like the flag, which like kind of like ties to the idea of power and nationalism in a different way than I think it was the Italian one where the soldier was like we were kind of like we were looking at him from like a lower standpoint, kind of like idolizing him.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
both of those are really good points. I didn't think about bringing up the posters at all, but those are tremendous points. Speaking of the World Cup posters, we've been talking about in class recently how soccer is used as a tool. I know my discussion question last Friday was like if countries still use soccer as a tool for control and power. But throughout class, we figured out that soccer indeed has become one of the largest tools for control and power. If in the text, the center fielder, when they talk about like how he kind of meant that much to a country and they dealt with him accordingly in the end. What does that speak to the power that, sports have on certain Latin American cultures?
I mean, Max, I don't know if you have anything, but the first thing that it made me think of was the fact that they had the power to change his story towards the end of like how he actually died. Um, I think just speaks to the level of influence that they know that he has over the people and just how big of an impact that soccer ultimately has on the citizens in Latin American countries and just all over the world in general.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. And I think in like that portion of the world is definitely like soccer plays a bigger role in that sense than anywhere kind of else. And like he's kind of like consumed by the system and then like discarded and like his death isn't like a moment for reflection and it's kind of like quiet. I guess like that's how soccer like influenced him in a way, I
Mhm.
guess, if that makes sense. And I think like most of like the newer like readings and movies that we've been like focusing on, like the soccer war especially, like it's like a literal example of how soccer like gets tied to political power
Mhm.
and how it's like a cover and like it goes to like deeper issues than that, like just through the sport. And I think that's like kind of amazing to me because I didn't think about it like that earlier.
Yeah, and I remember Professor Ventura in class made a pretty good comment based off our last discussion question Friday, which was like how now the Saudi Arabians and the countries in the Middle East are, buying out huge plots of land and making pop-up zones for soccer to culturalize their country because they see it as this business which is like insanely profitable.
Yeah.
And I think one of us mentioned in class that a recent Saudi Arabian club, signed one of the largest soccer stars in the world for $500 million, $1 billion within the last couple of years. So if we're looking in terms of like how soccer really does have power over the people, um, it's a huge investment capital for these Saudis to be, capitalizing on things like this just to have a control over their people, maybe make more money as the industry grows. And what a better way to do it than, signing one of the largest soccer stars in the world.
Yeah.
Um,
And
anyone? Yeah, keep going, Max. Sorry.
yeah, no, I just remember that we also talked about like the most recent World Cup in Qatar, how like since it was in the winter and stuff, we talked how it was like almost like modern day, like the closest thing to slavery, how they brought in all these people from different countries to build the stadiums for the World Cup that were like state of the art stadiums built like almost overnight. Uh, Kind of like in a way make their country look so great because it's like the most watched event in the world. And then right after the World Cup was over, like even now they're just all discarded and it looks like they've been built like 100 years ago. No one used them, which kind of just like proves that they built these stadiums and put all this money and effort and everything that they did into it to make like it look so good for the people that were watching just for the time that that happened.
Hmm. This was in uh the Olympic Games in Rio too. Is that what we were discussing in class earlier
Yeah,
Friday? Yeah,
yeah,
that too.
Yeah, I think that was it. I
Hmm.
think it's also interesting because it unconsciously also creates the power structure of like inclusion versus exclusion because like some countries just don't have the resources for that.
Hmm.
And so they don't really have that infrastructure, but it's still being brought in despite that. Um, but it just reminded me back to like, I mean, the idea that not everybody watches soccer, and even though it is a really big sport, so those that don't watch soccer are kind of in the exclusion group. Um, which reminded me of was it Paradise of the Lost, where they were talking about how it's this like special place, but there's an inside and there's an outside. There's a group that understands and there's a group that knows, but there's a group that doesn't. And in a way, the group that does know has power over that other group.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think we are past our 15-minute mark.
uh,
I'm not sure if
yeah,
it's we can go any longer, but in terms of time's sake with watching the class tomorrow, I think this wraps up our discussion.
yeah. All right,
All right,
perfect.
fantastic. I'm gonna
Thank
end
you
the
guys.
meeting and then
Yeah.
I'll send you a copy of this. Um, and I think we can all turn it in, I think.
All right, yeah,
All
that
right.
makes sense to me.